The US debt bubble is growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And when this debt bubble pops, in fact, it might have already popped, we are going to see one of the biggest recession and financial crashes of all time. Because right now, folks, pay attention to this. There is over $63 trillion in debt outstanding in America. That $63 trillion is comprised of consumer debt, government debt, and corporate debt, and it's over 3 times more than the total income that America brings in each year of $21 trillion. And as this bubble pops, you're going to see all of the zombie companies in America that are really supporting our economy, these companies that lose money but hire a lot of workers, these zombie companies are going to start to go bankrupt and they're going to go out of business, which is going to perpetuate a deep recession, deeper than most people can even imagine right now. Because I want you to take a look at this graph, everyone. It shows the growth rate in the number of businesses in America since the end of 2018. We can see a 10% growth in the number of businesses, increasing from 9.8 million to 10.8 million. Now, most would look at that graph and think that this is a good thing, that there's more businesses in America. But when you compare the blue line, the growth in businesses, to the orange line, the growth in employees over the same time period, you could see a problem. And that's that the number of employees through the end of 2021 in America was actually below where it was in 2018, yet the number of businesses was 11% higher. And so by looking at this data, you can all start to realize that in fact in America, we actually don't have a shortage of workers and employees, but we have on the other end a bubble and an overabundance in the number of businesses that often lose money that are allowed to exist because of the raging debt bubble that's occurred over the last several years and last several decades. This situation is creating the perception of a strong labor market and a strong economy in some circles, but when you begin to analyze the debt bubble, you start to see that this is all a house of cards. A house of cards that in recent years has been propped up by the US government spending money like a drunken sailor and taking out an epic amount of debt. I mean, just take a look at this, everyone. Back in 2008, at the peak of the last financial bubble and crash before everything really turned sour, the US federal government had $6.2 trillion in outstanding debt. Fast forward to today, and that's gone up by more than 500% all the way to $26 trillion. At the same time, consumer debt's gone up from $14 trillion to $18 trillion, while corporate debt's gone from $11 trillion to $20 trillion. And so, folks, this is what I call a debt binge. The government, consumers, and corporations in tandem are going nuts taking out debt, and this is ultimately what's been sustaining the US economy over the last 15 years, but especially over the last 2 years. Because during the pandemic, the US government pumped nearly $5 trillion of debt-fueled money into the economy, going to individuals and families, businesses, state and local governments, as well as healthcare agencies. But I know a lot of you are starting to look at this data and say to yourselves right now, wait a minute, this looks unsustainable. The government and consumers and corporations can't keep taking out debt forever, especially now that the Federal Reserve is tightening the screws on monetary policy. This is the big change that's occurred in the last 6 months from the previous 20 years, is that the Fed is now getting serious about fighting inflation. They're jacking up interest rates. They're taking money out of the system through quantitative tightening. And this is ultimately what's going to crash the debt bubble, because now, folks, that interest rates are up. If a consumer has a credit card, well, their credit card payments are going to go up and they can't take out as much credit card debt. If a corporation wants to issue a new corporate bond, well, now that corporate bond is going to be at a higher interest rate, which is going to deteriorate their profitability. And then the big one is really the US government. As US government debt continues to roll, with a massive 59% of all government debt maturing over the next 4 years, they're going to have to refinance it at higher interest rates, which is going to increase the cost burden of government debt service, which is ultimately going to mean less money in the budget in the future for stimulus checks and support for the economy. And so what this means, everyone, for you all out there, is that you better be preparing for this recession to be worse than anticipated, because a debt crisis recession, a debt bubble recession, well, that's the worst kind of recession. We saw in 2008 just how bad that could be. When a debt bubble pops, it takes years and years to recover. But what potentially makes today worse than 2008 is the fact that we have to deal with record levels of inflation, something we didn't have to deal with back then. Year over year, consumer prices in America are up by over 8%, and that throws a big wrench in the system, because inflation is a big economic headwind. The more that gas prices go up, the more that food prices go up, the less that people are going to have to spend on other goods goods and services in the economy. Now, in previous years and previous decades, if people started running out of money, they would have taken out more debt. They would have increased their credit card balances, or, the US government, like they did during the pandemic, would have sent stimulus checks to everyone, and that would have kept the economy going. Problem is that these things are really no longer viable solutions, because if we take a look at data over the last 50 to 60 years, we can see that right now in America, total debt is around 297% of personal income. That's again the 63 trillion in debt compared to the 21 trillion in income in America. Now, if we go back to the 1970s, we can see that the debt levels were a much more manageable 147% of total income. And so that meant that when the inflation surged in the 70s and 80s, it was bad, but Americans actually were then able to take out more debt in following years to compensate for the fact that the cost of goods was higher. So that kept the economy going. However, now in 2022, with this massive inflation surge, we don't have the room anymore to take out more debt, which is ultimately going to mean a debt crisis and a deleveraging in the economy that's going to be very painful. It's going to be like weaning off a drug. We've gotten so used to over the last 15 years that debt would come to the rescue, whether it was government debt or consumer debt or corporate debt. There'd be a way that money could come into the system and keep things going. And that's not going to happen in the same way going forward, which is going to lead to a lot of layoffs. It's going to lead to lots of company bankruptcies, and it's going to lead to an even further crash in the stock market, in the housing market, in the crypto market.